Hi friends, let's talk about the 10 worst foods that destroy your blood sugar. Now this list is not extensive because obviously there are literally tens of thousands of foods for you to choose from. However, if you learn the basic principles that I will outline throughout this video, then you will be empowered to make better choices, even if the foods aren't on this list. You will be surprised at how hard it is to identify good food from bad food. But throughout this video, I'm going to help you make better, healthier options to protect your body from foods that will destroy your blood sugars and raise your insulin levels. Now, the first and worst offender is processed red meats. Now, what does this mean? Is bacon as bad for you as sausage or organic hot dog or maybe turkey hot dog? Now, the problem with processed meats is that they add fats for texture. And my friend, she happens to be a retired neonatal ICU doctor. She got herself a job at a local restaurant as a cashier, working $12 an hour because she wanted to meet new people. I am so proud of her. Now, in the restaurant, I won't name any names, but this restaurant is the epitome of the standard American diet. And she was eating their pancake breakfast with sausage and eggs every morning. And I told her to stop eating that food. She was shocked and she thought that the pancakes and turkey sausages were healthy. Now, there are many problems with sausages, but the main problem is that it ruins your blood sugars because of the added fats. The average turkey sausage contains more fat than most people expect, especially because that fat is added back for texture and flavor, even after they use lean turkey to make it. So for a typical 2-ounce or 56-gram link or patty, a turkey sausage usually contains 7 to 10 grams of total fat, of which 2 to 3 grams are saturated fat. So that means roughly 30 to 40% of the calories are coming from the fat, even though it is marketed as a lighter option. Some flavored or breakfast-style turkey sausages can climb even higher, reaching 11 or 13 grams of fat, and 3 to 4 grams of that is saturated fat per serving. So the reason turkey sausage is not truly low fat is because they make it from the dark meat, the skin, and then they add oils to prevent dryness. Now you compare this with a plain turkey breast, which has about 1 gram of fat per 2 ounces. You know, the sausage processing increases the fat content really several fold. From a blood sugar and insulin sensitivity perspective, this added fat, especially saturated fat, can still impair glucose handling when you're eating it with carbohydrates. So that means when you eat that sausage with the pancakes, the fat in the sausage will spike and keep your sugar that was spiked high from your pancakes higher than it would have if you didn't eat that turkey sausage. Now, the hopeful part is that this process is totally reversible. Removing saturated fat restores insulin sensitivity very rapidly, often within days. Your muscle cells, you'll clear the fat droplets, your insulin receptors again will work like it's supposed to, and your glucose can once again enter your blood cells more efficiently. Now, how do you do that? By eating whole foods with fiber. So in short, sausages, even lower fat than pork sausages, are not whole food. They're not low fat food. And it behaves metabolically very different from whole unprocessed turkey breasts. And this is true for hot dogs, pepperonis, bacon. These are foods dense in saturated fat. And it also has fat inside the muscles, which then rapidly accumulate inside your muscles. You become foie gras. And you know how you absorb animal meat so much better? Yeah, you're absorbing all that fat too. And so once inside these fats, they actually interfere with your insulin receptor signaling by activating protein kinase C pathways, increasing your diacylglycerol buildup. Muscle becomes insulin resistant, meaning the glucose can't enter into your muscles, keeping your blood sugars elevated in your blood outside of your muscles longer than forcing insulin to rise higher to try to get it in. And over time, this actually puts a lot of stress on your pancreas, where eventually it will burn out. It will produce less insulin to keep up with your blood sugar rise. It won't be able to do it. And that's when you see even higher blood sugars. So when you see these high blood sugars, that means your pancreas is failing. Because if it wasn't, then you wouldn't see the high blood sugars. You would just see high insulin levels if you check the insulin. But the problem is people don't check insulin. They just focus on the blood sugars. And this is why people who eat processed meats, they often show worsening hemoglobin A1C, even when your carbohydrate intake is actually less than it was before. So if this is confusing you and going against advice you hear on social media, then please watch this again. Most people believe blood sugar problems come from eating sugar alone. And they only talk about sugar and carbs, but the damage actually starts much deeper and it's at the level of the fat inside your muscle cells. So long before you see these glucose spikes on your monitor, that saturated fat is blocking your insulin signaling in your muscle. It traps the sugar, it keeps it blocked in the bloodstream, and this forces your pancreas to work overtime. And this is why some people can can eat the same carbohydrates and have wildly different blood sugar responses. It depends on how functional your pancreas is and what else is on the plate, and how much fat is already in your muscles that's inhibiting your glucose from getting into your muscle cells. And it also depends on how much muscle you are starting off with. So saturated fat, it doesn't raise blood sugar immediately, but it makes your body unable to handle the sugar when it arrives. And that's a key idea most people miss, which is too bad because they continue to eat foods that makes their insulin resistance even worse. And usually people don't just eat processed meats. They usually eat processed meats with high-fat foods like cheese, especially hard and aged cheese. Cheese is one of the most concentrated sources of saturated fat in the modern diet, and it often delivers more fat calories than protein. So when you're eating saturated fat from cheeses, that increases your post-meal insulin resistance for hours, and sometimes into the next day. Cheese also stimulates a dopamine response that encourages overconsumption, creating a cycle where blood sugar control worsens while your appetite increases, right? You want to eat more. So this combination makes cheese particularly destructive for people struggling with prediabetes, diabetes, and weight. Have you seen what they put in cheese? Over time, lots of cheese aren't aged with time. They're highly processed and they're full of starches, artificial flavors, and colors. I don't even know why they qualify to be called cheese. And if you eat cheese, if you want to do a low-fat cheese, pick a high-moisture cheese. So avoid those hard-aged cheeses. The single lowest fat option is part skim ricotta, followed closely by low-fat cottage cheese. Your part skim ricotta is the lowest overall, and typically it contains about 0.5 to 1 gram of saturated fat per half a cup. And it's made from whey rather than whole fat milk, which dramatically lowers your saturated fat content. From a metabolic and blood sugar standpoint, it is far less insulin disruptive than hard cheeses. Low-fat cottage cheese is usually next, usually providing 0.5 to 1.5 grams of saturated fat per half a cup, depending on the brand. Now, it is higher in protein and, again, lower in fat overall. However, sodium can be a big issue. Fresh mozzarella or part skim, it contains more saturated fat than ricotta, but still ranks low compared to most cheeses, averaging 2 to 3 grams of saturated fat per ounce. And remember, whole milk mozzarella doubles that amount. Now, feta is often perceived as light, but it still contains 3 to 4 grams of saturated fat per ounce, placing it well above ricotta and cottage cheese, despite the fact that you're eating smaller portions. Now, for contrast, cheddar, Parmesan, brie, cream cheese, and blue cheese, they typically deliver 5 to 7 grams saturated fat per ounce, making them some of the most insulin-resistant promoting foods, period. So the key pattern is simple. The drier the cheese, the longer it's been aging, the more saturated fat you're going to have in that cheese. So when they ask you if you want some Parmesan on your salad, it would be probably best for you to skip it if you don't want to worsen your blood sugar spikes.
Hi friends, I am so thrilled that you want to take charge of your health and take charge of your food. Now, I know nutrition can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm here to support you in this lifelong journey. So if you point your camera app to this QR code, it'll take you to a link for a free handout that I created just for you. And if you like it, if you want to see other handouts, please go to the link in my show notes and then you can leave me your feedback on what I could do to help you in your journey. Okay, back to the video now.
Now, if you think about it, people gravitate towards creamier, softer foods. And that's why people add butter, which is the third food to avoid. And it doesn't matter if it's organic or grass-fed, saturated fat from butter will rapidly increase free fatty acids in your bloodstream, which directly compete with glucose for cellular entry. And when fat availability is high, cells preferentially will burn fat and reject the glucose. And the glucose has nowhere to go. So where does it stay? In your blood. That's why your blood sugars are high. And this is why pairing butter with bread or butter with potatoes, it leads to much higher blood sugar spikes. It promotes you to being pre-diabetic to diabetic. But if you skip butter, you can actually eat more of those carbohydrates alone. If you have to eat some fat with your foods, then use cooking oils. They are higher in monounsaturated fats, which will not keep your blood sugars high like saturated fat. However, it's still concentrated calories that make you gain weight faster when you overeat it. And when you are overweight, you will start releasing your own fatty acids that make you insulin resistant. So the best way to gain weight is to combine fats with carbs. And keep in mind that there is no commercial natural cooking oil that also doesn't have some saturated fat in it. The lowest saturated fat cooking oil are safflower oil and sunflower oil, especially especially the traditional versions. They still contain roughly 0.8 to 1 gram of saturated fat per tablespoon, folks. That means over 90% of fat is unsaturated. But if you're eating more than 1 tablespoon, you're getting a lot more saturated fat. And from a blood sugar and insulin sensitivity standpoint, they are better than butter and cheeses and creams. They are less disruptive. Canola oil is also lower. It has 1 gram of saturated fat per tablespoon. And it also has more monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. Now, olive oil, despite its health halo, it contains more saturated fat than people realize, about 2 grams per tablespoon. And this is still lower than butter or coconut oil, but again, it's not the lowest available. So number 4 is to avoid coconut milk, coconut cream, etc. Unfortunately, despite the fact that it is vegan, coconut cream is one of the most saturated fat dense foods in the modern diet. And its metabolic effects are often misunderstood because it's plant-based and it's marketed as all natural, right? It's probably one of the worst natural foods you can eat. That's plant-based coconut cream. It will destroy your blood sugars, keep you pre-diabetic, keep your weight on, because most of the water has been removed and you're getting pure fat. That's highly concentrated. A typical quarter cup of coconut cream that contains about 18 to 22 grams of total fat, of which 15 to 18 grams are saturated fat. That means over 80 to 90% of that fat is saturated, higher than butter and beef fat because you're eating more of it. The saturated fat in coconut cream is dominated by lauric acid and often described as medium chain fats that are supposed to be good for you. Now, yes, lauric acid is shorter than long chain fats. It behaves metabolically, though, more like a long-chain saturated fat. It can raise your LDL cholesterol, impair your insulin signaling, keep your blood sugars higher longer. It does not bypass normal fat metabolism in the way other medium-chain triglycerides can, like caprylic and capriic acid. Now remember, coconut cream doesn't raise glucose directly, but it significantly worsens your insulin resistance, so you can't eat the glucose or the starch or the carbohydrate. So after you eat rice, oats, fruits, dessert, it blocks your glucose from being taken up by your muscles and liver cells. Then your blood sugars stay higher longer, forcing the pancreas to secrete even more insulin. And that forces you to gain more weight. Now, coconut cream also promotes lipotoxicity, the accumulation of fat droplets inside muscles and liver cells. And these droplets interfere with insulin receptor signaling. And it also increases inflammatory stress within the cell. And over time, this is contributing to higher fasting glucose level, higher hemoglobin A1C levels, reduced metabolic flexibility. And another issue is portion distortion. Coconut cream is calorically dense and easy to overconsume in smoothies, curries, desserts, right? Even small amounts delivers a large amount of saturated fat, even in one meal. And that's enough to impair your insulin sensitivity for hours. So between coconut cream and full fat dairy cream, I would pick coconut cream for other health reasons. And that brings us to number 5, cream and full fat dairy, including heavy cream, half and half, and full fat milk, that will all worsen your blood sugars. These fats impair insulin sensitivity at the level of the liver and increases hepatic glucose output, even when blood sugar is already high. And the liver continues to dump glucose into the bloodstream. This compounds your post-meal spikes. And this effect is especially pronounced in the morning when your cortisol is elevated, which already will elevate your glucose. Number 6 is fried foods. So regardless of whether or not you eat meat or plant-based, frying your food increases saturated fat, which becomes oxidized in the fryer and more inflammatory. Oxidized saturated fats, it worsens your insulin resistance at a cellular membrane level. It stiffens your membrane and prevents insulin receptors from functioning properly. And this takes food to another level of damaging, even when your carbohydrate content appears low. So instead of deep frying, try air frying. You can use less oil and you can maintain a pretty crunchy bite. And unfortunately, fried foods are often sold with fast food meals. That's number 7, even if you skip the soda, because it's not the sugar, but the fat to carb combination in the rest of the meal. Saturated fat delays your stomach emptying while simultaneously blocking your insulin signaling. And this effect prolongs and exaggerates blood sugar spikes that can last for hours. And this is why people often see delayed spikes after fast food meals rather than immediate ones. So they get a false impression that they're safe from blood sugar surges when they're actually not. And that hamburger patty is pretty bad because it's a red meat that's processed. That brings us to number 8. Red meat, especially cuts like ribeye, briskets, short ribs, pork belly, and processed ground meat. These foods flood the bloodstream with saturated fat that accumulates in the muscles and liver cells. So over time, this leads to intramyocellular lipid buildup, a hallmark of insulin resistance seen even before people with diabetes develop any symptoms. Your muscle is inundated with fat, so it becomes metabolically inflexible and able to switch between fat and glucose efficiently. Hey folks, I know this sounds scary, but it really should be avoided and maximize the things to improve your blood sugars. And think about it, you're not just eating meat, you're often eating it with a ton of cream and sauces, which is number 9. Cream-based sauces and dressings appear healthy, but they're not because they're loaded with fat. I mean, it's not just on meat you have the same problem, right? Whenever you eat your vegetables, especially your root vegetables. Unfortunately, at least when you eat vegetables, you're getting protective mechanisms like fiber that's helped to trap the glucose in your gut. The unfortunate part is that most people don't eat enough vegetables to counteract all the meat and the processed grains that they are eating. And so the 10th item is anything made out of eggs, your pastries, your cookies, your cakes, your ice cream, because they're usually loaded with saturated fat food. Now, these foods, they combine refined carbohydrates, the sugar, and what else they're putting in it, with saturated fat, the most potent driver of insulin resistance. Fat impairs glucose uptake, while the sugar floods the bloodstream, creating a metabolic storm that accelerates beta cell exhaustion. And if you don't know already, you can bake without adding saturated fat. You just replace your saturated fat with pureed cashews or ground flax seeds. It actually tastes delicious. And if you want to have good blood sugars, then you really have to avoid lipotoxicity, which is saturated fat that accumulates inside muscle cells, accumulates in your liver, your pancreas, especially your beta cells, and it interferes with insulin signaling, with insulin release and inflammation, and reducing your blood sugars. And for most people, blood sugar is rising not because your sugar intake is all of a sudden excessive, but because your cells are no longer to be responsive. And this is why people can reduce sugar and still see worsening numbers if your saturated fat remains high. And the truth of the matter is, those who eat more whole foods with fiber outlives those who avoid carbohydrates. And if you want to learn more about longevity foods, watch the next video.